There we go.
As you can
As
notice,
you
the
can
top
notice,
right
top
on
right on
the
the
slide,
slide, climateready.boston.gov is our website for this project. So that's where we're posting all of our findings as they become available,
different events that
we're going to participate in.
Please follow that
Please
website.
follow that website
Continued
for continued
information.
information.
So the
So the
goal
goal
of
of
Climate Ready Boston is to generate critical solutions for the city, its buildings, its neighborhoods, its infrastructure to help the city continue to thrive as it faces impacts from long-term climate change, and to make sure that as we're addressing climate change, improving the quality of life in Boston in general. This particular project is coming on the back of a number of different assessments and reports over the last few years, where the city was identifying impacts to its own facilities and operations, where our partner groups were looking at additional impacts and suggesting solutions for how the city can live with water, and how both city and state partners were developing assessments on their own assets and infrastructure. So Climate Ready Boston is really an attempt to pull all of this information together in one place so that we can develop a strategic roadmap forward. Also important to note that this process is coming at a time when the City of Boston is also doing a number of other major planning processes, including Imagine Boston, which is the first master plan in 50 years, the mobility plan, Go Boston, the resilience strategy through 100 resilient cities, and the housing plan, and there's a couple others. So what's really important here is that Climate Ready Boston is informing these other plans, and these other plans are informing Climate Ready Boston as well. Just wanted to point out here an interesting map that shows how Boston has been pretty lucky over the last century or so, showing that there hasn't been a direct hit on the city. So on one hand, this process is meant to sort of get ahead of the next storm and understand what our risks and vulnerabilities are so that we can be prepared. But we're also looking at the long-term impacts to the city of climate change, of sea level rise, of increased temperature, of increased precipitation, and how we can begin adapting now so that we're prepared moving forward. This is the project that we are working on. In the fall, we launched a climate consensus report. This was a team of scientists led by UMass Boston with climate experts from across the state that were reviewing all of the reports and assessments that were done for the Boston and the New England region and recommending to the city what were the most reliable and up-to-date projections that we should be using. And that report was released on June 1st, and it's on our website, the full report and also a shorter summary, whose charts I will be presenting shortly. We're taking that information and putting it into an integrated vulnerability assessment, which looks at the city's built environment, its neighborhoods and residents, its infrastructure systems, and its natural systems to understand where exactly are those climate impacts going to be felt and where are they going to be felt worst. As part of that assessment, we are identifying geographic focus areas for the city, and following that, the resilience initiatives, a series of recommendations, both policies, programmatic, educational. Showing us how our future conditions and the impacts that Boston's going to be faced really depend on our actions today. A lot of the impacts, as you'll see, they range as we get later on into the century, depending on the global carbon emission scenarios that we're looking at. And it just highlights that the work that we do today on mitigation and on reducing our energies and reducing our carbon emissions will really impact the impacts that we face in the future.
Unmuted.
All right.
So these are the impacts that we're looking at Climate Ready Boston. One is increase in rainfall. As we can see here, this is looking at rainfall in terms of the 10-year, 24-hour design storm, which is the metric that the Boston Water and Sewer Commission uses to plan its stormwater management around. So we're seeing how rainfall is going to be increasing by the end of the century. We're also looking at the increase in temperature and the number of very hot days. So here you can see that now we're about 11 days above 90 degrees. And as we move forward, we could see that increase from between 20 to 40 days to potentially between 25 to 90 by the end of the century. On the flip side of that is the decrease in the number of very cold days, where potentially this could stay about where we are now, which is 120 days below freezing. This could be dropping, as you can tell, over the century to, at the most extreme, 34 days below freezing. And lastly, the impacts on sea level rise. What's important to note on all these projections is that through about mid-century, they are independent on the carbon emission scenario, meaning that we can start preparing for them now and we can expect these ranges more or less. And as I mentioned, as we get further on into the century, they're heavily dependent on how well the global community does in reducing its carbon emissions. So that's why you're seeing those ranges get a bit bigger if you're looking at business as usual scenarios or if you're looking at more intense emissions reductions. But here in terms of sea level rise, we're seeing by 2030 between 4 to 8 inches of sea level rise in Boston. By mid-century, this getting to be between 1 to 3 feet, and by the end of the century, potentially between 2 to 7 feet of sea level rise in Boston. So as you can see, all these impacts are pretty significant, and that's why the city is taking this very seriously now and working to not only assess the impacts, but develop a plan forward. So these are the impacts that we're looking at that we just went through: sea level rise, coastal storms, extreme precipitation, and extreme temperatures. And we're working with city and state partners and private companies as well to understand how these risks are going to be impacting the Boston community. So this is the infrastructure advisory group that has been working throughout this entire project to advise our work and provide feedback. They've provided data so that our assessment can be as comprehensive and accurate as possible. And along with the infrastructure side, we're also looking at social vulnerability very deeply. So these are the indicators of social vulnerability that the assessment is utilizing. They were recommended by Chief Atia Martin, who is our Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston, and this is part of her research as well. And we listed here on the side nonprofit groups and city agencies that have also been working with us to understand social vulnerability in the city and which populations in which areas are going to be feeling these impacts first and worst. So as we go into some of the early results from the vulnerability assessment, it's important to take a step back and look at the original map of Boston from, I'm not sure if this has a year on it, but a few hundred years ago, before areas of Boston were filled in. We see sort of the downtown area of Boston. Dorchester Flats to the right of it is where the seaport is now. To the left of it, we see where Back Bay is now. So it's important to keep in mind how Boston's landscape has already shifted over the last 100 years, because as we see moving forward, it's a lot of these areas that are more vulnerable to sea level rise. And here's an interesting video as well. We'll see if it works. Our city archaeologist Joe Bagley, who is in our department, put this together a couple months ago to show us how the landscape of Boston has shifted in the past and how it may shift in the future as well. All right, here we go. So we're looking here at the map of Boston today. And now we're going to go back in time to 1630. That was like the map that I just showed you. Even farther back in time, 3,000 years before present, 6,000 years before present, 9,000 years before present, 20,000. This is just a glacier. Now we're going back towards the present, 9,000, 6,000, 3,000, 1630, present day, and I think we have one slide looking to the future, potentially in 2100. So as you can see, the landscape of Boston has been shifting over time, but now with climate change, we can expect this to continue. And the question is here, how are we going to adapt and move forward? And that's what our planning process and our work is all about. So now I'm going to show you a few draft maps that are part of the Climate Ready Boston assessment. They are draft. We are actively working on all of these maps and on the recommendations that are coming out of it. So this is very much a sneak peek of what's to come. This map right here shows 2013 or current day flooding. It is pretty close to the FEMA flood maps that were updated in March. So this is the flooding that the city can expect. If you see in the blue, the 1% annual probability, that's also known as the 100-year storm. It's what flood insurance is based around and the FEMA maps are based around. So these are the categories that we're looking at: the 1% annual chance of this flooding event, a 10% annual chance, and the 0.2%. So now I'll go through a few additional maps that we have. Now we're looking at 9 inches of sea level rise. So this is estimated to about 2030. Again, we're seeing in the lighter blue that 1% annual chance, and in the darker blue the 10% annual chance of this flooding occurring. This map shows 21 inches of sea level rise, seeing those flooding areas spread throughout the city, and 3 feet of sea level rise, which is an amount looking towards potentially later parts of the century that the city might be experiencing. As I mentioned, the social vulnerability assessment is a key component of our work. So here we're overlaying that map of 3 feet of sea level rise with the tracks of low-income communities in the city of Boston to understand where does the social vulnerability and the climate vulnerability overlap so that we can make sure to focus there. Along with risks of flooding, we're also looking at extreme temperatures. This is a map that was developed through partnership with the Trust for Public Land and their Climate Smart Cities program, where we're looking at urban heat island hotspots in the city. So these are areas of the city that would be where the temperature would be greatest on high heat days, though the entire city would be warm. These are areas with a 1.25 degree difference from the land around them. And these areas would be hot spots primarily because of the built environment, lack of trees, and green space. These are a map of the nighttime heat vulnerability spots in the city, interestingly enough, focused in the Back Bay, surrounding areas in Allston. And now we're going to go back into some of the sea level rise and flooding maps. A part of the assessment is to take all this data and understand where the geographic focus areas of the city might be. So overlaying the social vulnerability data, the flood data, the heat data, sort of pulling it all together. So here is sort of some draft maps of our neighborhood, some of the neighborhood focus areas that we're looking at. So all of these maps look at the 9 inches, which is projected for around 2030 or so, and then the 3 feet, which is later on in the century. Because we don't know exactly when these scenarios would happen, the 9 feet and the 3 feet pose to, a little bit on ends of the spectrum of what we might be seeing in the short term and the farther term so that we can begin incrementally adapting now. So this is a map of East Boston with 9 inches of sea level rise. And then looking further out into the century with 3 feet. Same goes for the seaport, 9 inches here and 3 feet. This is an interesting map because we're also looking at the impacts of the monthly high tide in the future. So not just a one-off flooding event, but what the high tide events could look like in different parts of the city. And as you can see, we're overlaying a lot of different asset information from transportation to buildings to water systems. All of the work with that infrastructure advisory group has been to build out these maps and make sure that we're capturing all the right information. And these are some older maps that we're still working on, but wanted to call out some of the other focus areas. So here's the downtown. And then we'll move to Columbia Point. So those were some of the geographic focus areas that stand out in the assessment. Now we're going to move to a discussion on what are we going to do. And as I mentioned before, this is a highly evolving part of the report. We plan to release the report in the fall, and so this is all actively evolving, but we'll give you a taste of the thinking that's going into it. So for our Resilience Initiative recommendations, these are the principles that are underlying all of them. How do we develop recommendations and initiatives that support multiple benefits? So not only serve as flood protection, but additional benefits to improve quality of life in the city? How do we make improvements that are part of natural building cycles so that we're not expecting preparedness or adaptation to take place all at once, but we can take incremental steps over time to make sure that we have the levels of protections that we need as conditions change? How do we incorporate local involvement in all design and decision making? How do we develop adaptive and flexible strategies that can change, again, over time as more information is known and as conditions change, and that don't preclude additional protection or solutions to be implemented that may not exist right now? And how do we work in layers so that we are various different levels of solutions can all mutually reinforce one another? So we're looking at the building level, we're looking at the neighborhood level, we're looking at the citywide level, all at the same time, and not just depending on one of those levels to do all the work for us. These are the categories of recommendations that we are looking at. One is protected shores. What are the interventions that we need at a more district or citywide level to protect and prepare the city? In terms of our infrastructure systems, how do we make sure that our transportation system, our power system, our water systems are all resilient enough to withstand both chronic impacts and acute or one-off shocks? How do we adapt our buildings, both new development and existing buildings that are already there, to make sure that they are resilient, that they're energy efficient, that they are prepared for the conditions in the future? And how do we focus on our communities and our neighborhoods to make sure that residents, especially those that are most vulnerable, have the resources and the support that they need to be prepared? So these are the categories that we're looking at. And as you can see, this is not all work that the city can do alone. It requires a lot of partnership and a lot of coordination with our state partners, with our federal partners, with our community partners, and with all of you. This is our website, as I mentioned at the beginning. The early findings on the climate projections are located right here under the Findings tab. And our vulnerability assessment and report will also be posted here as they become available. So please keep checking here for more information on events and findings. Here's what that findings page looks like. So that's it for the presentation. We're now going to start answering a few of your questions in the order that they were received. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. And if you are a member of the press, we ask that you indicate that by sending us a quick note in the questions tab. All right. Great. All right, hello again. So thank you to those that send questions in advance. We're going to try to go through a few of those now. And as I mentioned before, if we don't get to your questions, we will try and follow up with you. And feel free to be in touch with us as well. All right. Our first question comes from Maynard Clark. How can anything that private individuals do reduce the risk of sea level rise? That's a very good question. As you can see, sea level rise is a big issue. It impacts the city and the region, the country as a whole. But there are some things that individuals can do. For example, we can start by learning a lot about this issue and making sure you're informed about the work that we're doing, the impacts that the city is facing, and the recommendations as they're developed for how to address it, and how, you know, as a homeowner, as a renter, as a building owner, what you can do within your own properties to make some changes. You know, it's also important to connect with your local environmental or climate groups who are active on this issue and who are working with us on this particular project and on other efforts. And there's many opportunities for you to tell the city that you're interested in this question and that you're concerned the city's listening. And there's a lot of forums where the city is listening. Most important right now is the Imagine Boston 2030 process, where one of its top goals is preparing and adapting to climate change. And of course, as we mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of important mitigation actions that residents can take. The impact that we make now in reducing our carbon emissions is going to go a long way to reducing the impacts that we face in the future due to climate change. So efforts to reduce energy use, reduce carbon emissions are really key. Anything to add here?
That was great. Let's move on to the next question.
Great. Our next question comes from Allison, who asks, how is Boston preparing to protect its historic resources from the impacts of climate change? Excellent question, Allison. So this is really important to us as well. As you may or may not know, the Landmarks Commission is a part of our department, and it is their job to protect the historic resources of our city. So on one hand, we are including all of that data in our assessment, and we are mapping where those historic assets are, how vulnerable they are, and what we need to do to protect them. And we're also working closely with the Landmarks Commission on the recommendations that are coming out related to retrofitting or protecting existing development. So that's definitely something that is on our radar and that we are working to address. Our next question comes from Perry. Why did the city allow all that development in South Boston? I am all for innovation districts, but why create one so close to the water? That is a great question, Perry. And that is exactly why we're doing this work, is to understand where our risks are and to begin putting in those protections and those preparedness actions to make sure that we're addressing them. The seaport is a really important economic growth center for the city, and we are focusing on it as one of several geographic focus areas to understand what are both the building level and the larger district level solutions that need to be put in place to protect that area. That being said, we're also very focused on areas of the city where social vulnerability is high and where there is a significant amount of critical infrastructure. And so those are our priorities as well, along with looking at building level and neighborhood level protections in commercial areas like the seaport. Another thing that's important to note is that the city has a checklist through the BRA, the Boston Redevelopment Authority. It's called the Preparedness and Resiliency Checklist, and it asks all developers of large projects to complete it and tell us how they are considering the impacts of climate change in their project. And that's a checklist and a conversation that we go through with each new development of large projects And that's been an important tool to have those conversations and to push developers to consider this issue more seriously. So our next question comes from Julie. I've been very happy to hear Boston representatives talk about the benefits of investing in preparedness over emergency response. What do you see as your best investment in on-the-ground preparedness to date? That is a great question. Personally, I think the example of Spalding Hospital is a great one that we often point to as on-the-ground preparedness actions where critical infrastructure was elevated, where the first floor is able to be flooded if needed, where there are windows that can be opened without electricity, measures like that. So Spalding's a great example of on-the-ground preparedness actions that have been implemented today that you can go and see. And we work closely with the Office of Emergency Management, who is really the expert in this space of on-the-ground preparedness and disaster preparedness and management. They are the experts here, and so we work closely with them on their efforts. So I would encourage you to look to them and understand their role in this issue as well.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the partnership that we have with the Office of Emergency Management, they have done phenomenal work in updating the evacuation routes out of the city and making sure that we're as climate prepared as we can be for a severe weather event that may occur right away. And so that office, in conjunction with ours, is working on these analyses as well, Climate Ready Boston, and the body of work that the Environment Department has done in terms of our long-term planning to make sure that not only are we as prepared as we can be now, but that when sea level rise and other issues continue to impact the city of Boston in a more severe way, even urban heat island effects, making sure that we adjust where we can provide some cooling centers and other shelters through the BCYF and other departments. It's a really great partnership, and it's kind of foundational work that they've done on the evacuation side and getting things back to normal as quickly as possible. And our department, our role is really saying, okay, well, 10, 20, 30 years from now, what are the projects and what are the partnerships that we need to have with our other state partners or with the federal government to ensure that Boston is climate prepared from a policy perspective, as well as from a project and implementation perspective over that longer term.
Great. Our next question comes from Kathy. And there's a great deal of new development coming into Boston. What provisions does the city have to ensure that the energy needs of those buildings will be met by renewables rather than increasing our dependence on natural gas? Another good question. The city has a number of efforts and programs to make sure that we're working to use renewables and that we're increasing the energy efficiency of our buildings. There was an entire study called the Community Energy System Study that was focused on microgrids and the feasibility of those and where would be the most important parts of the city to look at the rollout of microgrids. The Renew Boston program is also focused on increasing energy efficiency and renewables throughout the city and increasing financing to those as well. And so this is a really important question for the city and a place where our department has done a lot of work on it. All right. Another question from Kenan. How can community organizations with resiliency in their mission help the city prepare for the C40 summit? So, great question. As you may have heard, the city is hosting the U.S.-China Climate Summit sometime next summer. This is in very early stages of development and planning, so we'll have to stay tuned for that, but we hope that there'll be lots of roles for community organizations to work with us around that event and in general on our work moving forward. The Greenovate program is launching neighborhood networks, which is a recommendation that's come out of the Climate Action Plan that was updated in 2014. And that's going to provide an infrastructure and a foundation for community groups to work together and to work together with the city to advance a lot of these important goals that we all share.
Yeah, again, if you've already reached out to be a part of this webinar, you're already on the right track. Definitely reach out to our office if you're interested in getting involved. Right now, we're at the point where we're collecting as many of the stakeholders that want to participate as possible. The exchange in both Beijing as well as in LA is the formal part of the program is really focused on that government exchange between the federal governments, or I should say the national government level, and the subnational government level, and then also between cities. But the vision that the mayor and I have is to make sure that we take the opportunity through this summit to really highlight a lot of the great work that's going on in the city of Boston, highlighting the work that's not just happening in municipal government, but also in the business community, in the advocacy community, in our nonprofits, and in academia. Obviously, Climate Ready Boston is a great example of that because we've really brought together all of the stakeholders across those groups to push these initiatives forward. And so we're working through the opportunities to do that, likely surrounding the core programs of those exchanges, whether it's in the days before or in the evenings after the more formal exchanges, but providing the opportunities and the space needed to make sure that we are able to highlight the great work that many of you are doing.
Absolutely. So, a few more questions that have come in over the course of the presentation from Graham. How does this report align with the climate action plan that many of us participated in? So this report is really coming out of the climate action plan in a lot of ways. The 2014 climate action plan was the first place where preparedness was really fleshed out and expanded on for the city of Boston. And many of those recommendations outlined a need for a comprehensive assessment for the city, for a consensus on the climate projections that the city is facing, for recommendations on geographic focus areas and more detailed strategies. So this report and this process is really coming out of those recommendations and is addressing those recommendations. And as we look to the next update of the climate action plan in the coming years, the recommendations coming out of Climate Ready Boston and the work that we're going to be moving forward in the coming years will be wrapped up back in there. And those two processes are going to be speaking to one another and pushing one another forward.
Right. As many of you are familiar with, the city of Boston has been looking at climate preparedness for quite some time. And we've worked with our partners at OEM as well as with FEMA on a handful of initiatives and to ensure that the city could be in compliance with many of the regulations. OEM's done great work with the National Weather Service to make sure that the city of Boston is part of their Storm Ready program, only one of 15 cities in the state of Massachusetts that qualified for that. But in terms of how this work relates to the Climate Action Plan in 2014, it was a strategy to, as Maya mentioned, to make sure that we were really pushing forward on climate preparedness. And Climate Ready Boston really is that initiative that checks the box for us on that, looking on a parcel by parcel basis where we are going to be vulnerable and putting some more math and analytics behind it. So it's not just identifying those locations, but then giving us recommendations and a roadmap in terms of how we can prepare the city of Boston in the most cost-effective manner and making sure that we're protecting our vulnerable populations as well.
More questions coming in. So one from Sharon, are you considering protecting hubway bikes and stations in resiliency efforts? Answer to that is yes. Two components. One is our connection with the Go Boston 2030 mobility planning effort. We're working really closely with them to inform their recommendations and their work based on our findings and our assessment. So that's a connection that we have with the Boston Transportation Department to emphasize ideas and initiatives such as this. We're also working closely with the State Department of Transportation. Their assessment on the vulnerability to the central artery system was actually the most advanced modeling of climate impacts for the Boston area, and that's the data set and the information that we're basing our assessment on as well. So that connection there and connection on the recommendations and the work that's coming out of their assessments point to not only the importance of the protection of the transportation system and more individual elements of it, such as subway bikes, but the continued coordination between the city and the Department of Transportation and the state departments as well on the impacts on transportation. So here we have a question from Philip. What types of funding sources do you anticipate will be used to finance the city's response? And that's a good question.
It's a phenomenal question, Philip. And I think the short answer is that it's too early to say exactly what those will be. But I think the more detailed answer is that this has to be a partnership. In terms of the areas that we need to protect, it's certainly not just city assets. It's certainly not just assets that are owned by our utilities. It's certainly not just assets that are run by the state, whether that is through Massport or MBTA or MassDOT. And that's the reason why we brought together all of these partners to really help us understand the issues that they face, whether it's from sea level rise or from urban heat island effects, or what the demands on the electric grid may look like 50, 60 years from now on our stormwater systems as well. And as we develop that roadmap in terms of the specific projects that we need to take action on, that'll give us insight in terms of how we would then best and most appropriately finance these projects. But they're certainly not all going to be financed by the city. There would certainly be some partnership with the state, and depending on what those solutions would look like, maybe even from the federal level as well.
A question from Patricia. Does the city anticipate addressing financial incentives for the private sector to adapt to climate change? So the answer to this is yes. As part of our adapted buildings set of strategies, we're looking at recommendations around financing, around education and increasing awareness among developers, tenants, residents, and audit programs for how building owners or tenants can better understand what exactly their particular risks are. So we are looking at the financing side, but also along with that, the education side and the auditing and the side, and how resilience programs can connect with the city's existing energy efficiency programs. All right, a couple more. Sarah, is the video of Boston's changing landscape for classroom use? Yes, absolutely. This was posted by the city archaeologist, Joe Bagley, on the Boston Archaeology site a couple months ago when it was developed. He also has a number of other videos looking at Boston's changing built environment over time that are absolutely for classroom use. Question for, so we have several people asking about, do you know how Boston Public Schools can prepare? So that's a really good question, and I think that's going to be a conversation that really comes out of this assessment and this work. We're definitely looking at Boston Public Schools in the assessment along with the rest of the city's assets, but this is a particularly important one. And in terms of both the actual buildings and facilities, in terms of the landscaping around them, in terms of the education and the curriculum that could potentially be introduced to students. There are a number of different opportunities for how Boston Public Schools can work with us more closely on this issue. And it's something that we hope to pursue moving forward.
And it's something in terms of climate preparedness, it's something also that Boston Public Schools is looking at as part of Build BPS and their facilities master plan as well, not only from a preparedness standpoint, but also from a community efficiency as well.
A question from Katie: how did you create the future flood maps? Good question. And our report will lay out the details of that from our consultant team that worked on those. But basically, we used the flood models that came out of the Massachusetts Department of Transportation's vulnerability assessment of its central artery system. So they modeled, what flood risk and flood impacts look like over time. And we overlaid those with the cities, with hundreds of layers of assets and buildings and infrastructures onto the city. And so you can see those Massachusetts Department of Transportation maps right now. They're online on their website under the Central Artery Vulnerability Assessment Study. And that was the modeling basis that underlied our own assessment.
So this is the last question that we have.
Here we go. Are you working? This is a question from Madeline. Are you working with libraries to help them prepare? So I just sort of goes into the BPS question before. As this assessment is completed and our recommendations and report is finalized and it's released, yes, we're going to be working with all city departments to understand how they can best prepare and take actions, and what are the programs and actions that we need to work with outside of the city to our private sector or state or community group partners as well. So this is all conversations and work that have started and that will continue with the launch of this report, which really provides that very comprehensive foundation to a lot of this work moving forward in the future. So thank you all very much for taking part in the webinar today. Thank you for your great questions. And if you have more questions, please feel free to be in touch through the Greenovate website, and we will try to answer those for you. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar so that you can watch it again. And we'll also be sending out a survey to ask what you thought about the webinar and what you think about this issue in general, so that we can get a better sense of your opinions on this, and that we can stay in touch as this report is finalized and released and the work continues. We'd really appreciate if you do fill out that survey, and we will be giving out, let's see, 2 $20 gift cards to swap.com, which is an online consignment store. So please fill out that survey, and thank you again for taking your time to be here. We appreciate it, and we look forward to staying in touch. Thanks.